Today we're going to talk about the Tricky Terrain Commander deck, which is one of the four for Modern Horizons 3. We've covered two so far. We've got two to go, and we're going to look at some cards like Planar Nexus, which is an insane land that we talked about, in a video a couple weeks back, and Rampant Froghantua, just to name a few. But without further ado, let's jump into the video and look at the Tricky Terrain Commander deck for Modern Horizons 3. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. If you do enjoy the video, please hit that like button. If you haven't already done so, feel free to subscribe. Click the bell icon if you want to be notified when new videos are posted. And yes, today we are talking about Tricky Terrain. It is the third of four Modern Horizons 3 Commander decks, and it's kind of it's sneaky good. I think this one's maybe a little bit under the radar in terms of the decks because it has some insanely good new cards, but some really strong reprints as well. So we're going to talk about all of it. As usual with these, we'll talk about the new cards first, and then we'll talk about the reprints. I'm trying not to make the videos take an insane amount of time, but again, there is a lot to cover, so thanks for sticking with me, those of you who do watch. But yes, let's get into the new cards for this deck. Starting us off, we've got the Face Commander, which is Omo, Queen of Vesuva. It is 2, and then I believe this is, I always forget the damn name for the color combinations, and I try to remember on the fly, and I can never get there, but I think it's Simic. 2 in any Simic energy. Legendary creature, Shapeshifter, Noble. Whenever it attacks or enters the battlefield, put an everything counter on each of up to one target land and one target creature. Each land with an everything counter on it is every land type in addition to its other types, and each non-land creature with an everything counter on it is every creature type. Really, really cool for a lot of reasons. For one, it does not cost a lot, so it's a pretty cheap commander to bring out. And two, the amount of pathways, I guess, that this opens up for you to actually take a deck in is pretty significant. Being able to play this with lands like Urza's lands or Caves or any of the other lands that care about being a bunch of different types, obviously really good. Domain mechanics work really well with this. Same for, the non-land creatures with the counters. Obviously, the downside is that if this is not on the field, the counters don't do anything, so this does have to stay out in order to get the max benefit from it. But it's a really, really well-designed card that I think seems like a really fun commander. A lot of different directions you can take it in, so I'm interested to see what people come up with this card because I do think it's a really fun card on paper and really kind of spotlights one of the most fun aspects of Commander is like the deck building and being able to kind of choose a path, craft around it, but be able to take it in so many different directions. And I just think this card does a really good job of that. GOT, Moag Ancient is 2 green, blue, legendary creature, elemental. When it enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 green forest dryad land creature token for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. At the beginning of each combat, land creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is its power. Very cool card, obviously very different in the way it plays. There are plenty of decks that want to turn lands into creatures. There are cards that straight up bring lands from the deck and make them creatures. So you could definitely do a lot of fun things with this. It's just not necessarily going to play the same way Omo is, which is okay because ultimately choosing a face commander and taking a different direction with the deck is sort of the fun of it. You get the precon, you find out what you like best, and then you build on it from there. So it's a really cool card. It obviously, being able to create a good amount of tokens, land creatures, means you are going to have extra mana ramping, in a deck that already can kind of do that. And there are plenty of cards, like I said, that can turn your lands into creatures. Planeswalkers, enchantments, there's a billion of them. And maybe we'll take a more in-depth look at some of that stuff in a future video when we're not talking about just the new cards themselves. But yes, it's pretty cool. I like Omo a little bit better, but I think both of them are pretty solid for what they are. Next up, we've got Copy Land. This is 2 and a blue enchantment. You may have it enter the battlefield as a copy of any land on the battlefield, except it is an enchantment in addition to its other types. Very similar to Copy Enchantment, which quite literally enters the battlefield as a copy of any enchantment. Again, though, a really solid card. Obviously, you can't copy legendary stuff with it. It'd be kind of crazy if you could. But being able to have extra land types out, being able to, have different things going on while also having it as an enchantment. Obviously, there are a lot of decks that can utilize Lotus Fields, one I thought of, being able to bring this out and make copies of those. There's a lot of different ways to make this card work and a lot of different synergies with it. I don't think it directly benefits from either commander specifically, but it's a cool card that'll find its way in some different decks down the road. March from Velisvel is 2 and a blue sorcery. Choose a non-basic land type. Each land you control of that type becomes a copy of target creature you control until end of turn and gains haste until end of turn, and then it has flashback. This one is really, really cool. So target choose a non-basic land type. Let's say Urza's, for example, Urza's land, or cave, whatever. Each land you control of that type becomes a copy. So if you have a bunch of different caves out, you target a creature, and then you turn all your caves into copies of that creature with haste. You can do some silly shenanigans with that right off the bat, and I mean, I can sort of think some combo lines out in my head, but I haven't really parsed enough research on this to go in and really look at it. But again, maybe warrants its own video. Like, the amount of combos and stuff that you can do with this card are certainly not endless, but there are a lot of them, and being able to turn your lands into some powerful creatures, it's pretty funny. There's got to be some ways. So let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. What comes to mind for you that might be able to abuse this the most? Because clearly it's a really strong card. It's just a matter of, finding the right situations in which to use it. Alright, next up we've got Wonderscape Mage. It's 1 and a blue flying creature Moonfolk Wizard, which seems to fill the 1 Moonfolk quota for every blue commander deck we get most of the time. You can tap, return a land you control to its owner's hand, draw a card, then discard a card unless that land had a non-basic land type. Obviously, it has some potential because of lands that do stuff upon entering the battlefield, and maybe lands that tap to do stuff and then you bring them back in. There are clearly ways this card can work. In most cases, you may end up discarding a card more often than not, because some of the lands this card may synergize best with are going to be lands that actually have effects that do stuff versus just being a land with a type. But if you are playing it with stuff that does have that going for it, you can, get the benefit of bouncing it back to play it later. If you're maybe playing, obviously in green-blue, there's plenty of cards that allow you to play multiple lands, so cards like Azusa, you can bounce something, play it back. Obviously, I'm thinking of cards like Gaia's Cradle as one that, like, you have that out, you tap it for a bunch of mana, you bounce it back to the hand, you play it again. But that's a really expensive card that obviously is not going to be an applicable example to the majority of people. Still, there's ways you can utilize it, and that's pretty cool. There's obviously a lot of lands that do stuff when they enter the battlefield, so this will work really well with those too. Desert Warfare is 3 and a green enchantment. Whenever you sacrifice a desert, whenever a desert card is put into your graveyard from your hand or library, put that card onto the battlefield under your control at the beginning of your next end step. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control 5 or more deserts, create that many 1/1 green, red, white sand warrior creature tokens. They gain haste. So, more desert cards, which is awesome to see. We did talk about the Desert Commander deck that came out with the last set. Of course, Outlaws at Thunder Junction. This is a really, really strong card specifically for that deck. And obviously, this Commander deck here has a bunch of cards that can treat themselves as deserts, can become deserts. So it's a big boost for that deck. Obviously, if you mill a desert card or somehow get it into the grave from your hand or library, you can bring it out onto the battlefield. That's an extra way to not only get some extra mana going out, extra lands, but you can then create a bunch of tokens with it too, with haste. Just a really, really good card across the board. It's awesome design, really, really strong for the desert deck. If you pick that deck up and you want to make some upgrades to it, this is going to be one of the first cards you're going to want to divert your attention to, in my opinion. Rampant Frogantua, 2 and a green creature frog with trample. It gets +10/+10 for each player who has lost the game. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may mill that many cards, then put any number of land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped. This is an absolutely insane card. First of all, the artwork is completely ridiculous in the best way, but I don't even know of any other cards that do stuff for opponents that have lost the game. They may exist, but I'm not familiar with any off the top of my head. Only one person has to be eliminated for this to be a 13/13 with trample that can do damage and just stack you with lands. It is kind of goofy, but it's also pretty strong in terms of being able to be a powerhouse, especially if you save it for the right moment to play. Yeah, it's a cool card. I like when they make some goofy, more outlandish designs, and this card is definitely no exception. Nothing, the flavor win, design win, and potentially playability win, so we'll take it on all fronts. Sage of the Maze is 2 and a green creature elf wizard. Tap, add 2 mana in any combination of colors, or tap until end of turn, target land you control becomes an XX citizen creature with haste, in addition to its other type, where X is twice the number of gates you control. Activate only as a sorcery. Tap and untap gate you control. Untap Sage of the Maze. So, gate support. Again, this deck is kind of appealing to a ton of different land-based strategies. This is a pretty damn solid card because you can do the gate untapping and tapping thing multiple times, meaning you can untap, tap the gate, untap this, add 2 mana on any combination of colors, and get a lot of stuff going there. Pretty strong card overall for gate decks. I don't think it's necessarily going to be much use in other ways, but I guess it is still a 3-drop that you could tap for 2 mana on any combination of colors, so it's not the worst in multicolor decks as other options, but overall, a pretty good card across the board. And that's always good to see in Precon, see some well-designed cards. Aggressive Biomancy is next. It's a sorcery that's 2x, green, blue. Create X tokens that are copies of target creature you control, except they have, when this creature enters the battlefield, it fights up to one target creature you don't control. Now, a lot of times whenever cards come up with X in the cost that are applicable for the mana base, I always mention the Tyranid decks from Warhammer. One of my close friends plays the deck in our playgroup, and I see it a ton, and I'm always like, man, there are just some cards that work extremely well with that, and this is definitely one of them. But it's also just a decent card across the board. The biggest drawback, of course, is the fact that X, you got to pay X twice in order for this to really work. So it's going to cost you at least 4 to do it once. If you can get, so 4, 6, 8, you start to make a lot of copies. It's definitely still really good because when you're bringing this out, the tokens are fighting stuff. So it's a pseudo board wipe. And if the tokens you make that are target, copies of a creature that either, has indestructible or is more powerful and can just kind of wipe stuff out, it can be a really good card for, blue-green to have access to, because that color combination doesn't have a ton of straight board wipes. So obviously you have cards like Cyclonic Rift and blue. Green doesn't really have a lot of them, so this is going to be a good buff for that, especially for, those Simic color combinations. It's a pretty good card overall. It's a little bit on the costly side, I think, but in Commander specifically, I think it's going to be one that you can make work really well, and, potentially just kind of swarm the field if you have the mana to pay for it. Now we get into some lands that are all just extremely good. Horizon of Progress is the first one here. It's a regular land that says tap, pay 1 life, add 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. So it's like similar to like a Reflecting Pool, I guess, but you have to pay the life. You can also pay 3 and tap it to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or you can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice Horizon of Progress, then draw a card. So a lot of utility here. Does allow you some additional color, mana fixing, if you will. Obviously, as long as you have another land out, this card's never going to be dead, quote unquote. Being able to accelerate by putting some extra lands out is certainly an interesting thing. Lands that maybe come into play tapped and then untap on your turn if you use this with some extra mana. And of course, paying 1 to sack and draw a card is never going to be bad, especially when you have ways to bring lands back. Just overall a pretty well-rounded card. I think it might be the weakest of the lands in this particular deck, but that doesn't even mean it's bad. It's just some of these other ones are a little bit crazier. Lazotep Quarry is a land desert that taps for colorless. You can tap, sack a creature, add a mana of any color, or pay X and 2 to tap, sack a desert, exile target creature with mana value X from your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie, activate only as a sorcery. So it's like Scarab God made into a land, almost. Being able to make copies of stuff from the grave is great. You don't have to sacrifice this card specifically, just a desert. Obviously, with a lot of the new desert stuff, there's plenty of ways to bring the deserts back, so that's not a huge drawback. But it not only is it a desert, it can tap for colorless, it doesn't come in tapped on its own, and it has a lot of different utility. So overall, a really good upgrade for the desert decks with some really fun potential with that last effect, depending on which deck you're playing it in. Planar Nexus, we made a whole video about. I'm not going to go into it a ton other than to say this card is insane. It is pre-selling at a very high price, and I think that's one of the biggest reasons that this Commander deck may be a little overlooked in terms of value. I just think this card's going to be expensive no matter what. I mean, it does so much, and being every non-basic land type is crazy, and just in the future, if they make more, it's always going to be good. Not to mention, it can still tap for colorless or mana of any color. It's by far the best card in the deck, in my opinion, and it's just an extremely good card. If you guys want to check out my video on it, you can go ahead and do that, because we did go, into full detail about some of the best strategies that it works in. But yes, Planar Nexus, obviously a home run card, and it's going to be really good. Sunken Palace is a land cave. It enters battlefield tapped. You can tap it for blue, or pay 1 and a blue to exile 7 cards from your grave, add 1 blue mana. When you spend this mana to cast a spell or activate an ability, you may copy that spell or ability and choose new targets for the copy. Pretty cool. Obviously, more cave support is always good. Some of the cave cards, obviously it entering tap kind of sucks. Cards like Spelunking can make it so it doesn't enter tap, but, in Commander, that's a one-of. Just a pretty good card across the board, being able to copy stuff. You're essentially paying 1 mana to use the effect because you're getting a blue back, but we all know that blue, especially in decks like Izzet, love to copy stuff. It's going to find a place. Having a land that allows you to copy spells when you play them, even for 1 costs, are going to be pretty good. The downside being you can exile a lot of cards in the graveyard, but in decks that can kind of make use of cards like that, you're going to be able to do that pretty easily, so nothing too crazy there. Alrighty, and moving on to the final 2 cards that are new in the deck. Talon Gates of Madara is a land gate. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target creature phases out. and then you can tap it to add a colorless, pay 1 and tap it to add a mana of any color, or you can pay 4 to put it from your hand onto the battlefield. There are not too many lands that activate at instant speed like this with that last effect, and it is extremely strong as a result. Being able to phase this in at any time and then basically phase out one of your creatures would allow it to, you know, avoid destruction. You can phase out one of your opponent's creatures to either, like, allow an attack to get through, to stop a combo from going off, you know, whatever you want to do. But this, again, is a utility card that's just extremely strong because it can be played from the hand at instant speed, and it's also just a really unique effect that, you know, we talked earlier about the merfolk that can bounce stuff. This is certainly a card that could utilize that, and because it does have a non-basic land type, you don't have to discard. Gates, I think, will like this as well, but I mean, in general, I think this card's going to see a lot of application across the board, because realistically speaking, it's generally a decent card that doesn't enter tapped, and I can't see an argument why you wouldn't want to play this in most decks. And finally, we've got Trench Post. This is a Locust land, and it tap for 1 colorless or pay 3, tap. Target player mills a card for each Locust you control. Again, being able to make other lands into Locust with cards like Planar Nexus is certainly cool. In Vintage, I think someone commented on one of my previous videos that there are decks that play like 12-ish Locusts. Well, now we've got 4 more you can add in there. And if you're playing a deck focused on that, you can then kind of make players mill a lot of cards. It's just a decent card, and it's nice to see Locust get a little bit more support. It's, comparatively to a few of the other ones we talked about, not exactly game-breaking, but still a decent card, and overall not a bad inclusion. Alright, and before we actually wrap the video, let's take a look at a few of the reprints, because there's definitely some noteworthy ones that you're probably going to want to get your hands on. Reprints are always really important in a Commander deck because there is, you know, the expectation of value. The new cards alone are decent, but being able to get some cards cheaper is part of the incentive to spend 50, 60, 70, whatever dollars on a deck. And this, you know, this one has some pretty good reprints that I think in conjunction with the new cards is really going to make the value worth it. We've got Propaganda, pretty solid card, not the craziest value, but definitely not a bulk card either. And it has its uses, so to see it get reprinted here should hopefully bring the value down. Pongify, pretty good card for blue, definitely a solid out to stuff, at least $5, if not a little bit more on average before this, so we'll see if it drops at all. I don't think it really will do too much for the value, but you might have a chance to get one a couple bucks cheaper. Yavimaya is a really, really good reprint, obviously out of Modern Horizons 2. It's like $15 at this point, and if you're playing green, there's really no reason not to play it. You know, hopefully that'll drive the price down for at least a little bit. Mana Reflection, a card I didn't even know existed until I started doing the review for this video. Like a $20 card at least. Really, really good reprint, and it obviously fits well with the theme of the deck. And then Dryad of the Elysian Grove, getting another reprint here. It was in the Commander Masters, I believe, Enchantment deck, so not too far back, but, you know, far enough back that the value of it had started to go back up. And this one has an alternate art. It's a different artwork, too, so that's pretty cool. And there's also some pretty good cards that are, you know, a buck or two in here, but in terms of noteworthy stuff, this is kind of really where you're going to be getting a little bit of extra value. But I have to say, I think overall, the new cards is going to be what makes the value of this. These lands, specifically Planar Nexus and Talon Gates, are going to be really good in so many different decks, and I could be wrong. It happens. I'm not pretending to be an expert, but I do see both of those cards being worth a good bit over time, and so if you're thinking about getting the deck and you can get this deck at or around retail, I would absolutely recommend it. I wouldn't spend, you know, crazy amounts of money for it, but you know, if it's a couple bucks markup, it may not be the worst if you're interested in getting some of the cards, because I do think this deck, assuming they don't continue to reprint it into the ground, could end up aging well over time just due to the new cards and the inclusions within. So that's going to do it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know in the comments down below what you think of Tricky Terrain. I definitely think it's pretty good. It might even be better than the Eldrazi deck, realistically speaking, in terms of the actual cards within, but Eldrazi is Eldrazi, and there's obviously going to be demand for that. I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace.